Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, you guys absolutely crushed that map quiz. Averages in like the 90s, right? It's absolutely wild. So for those of y'all that did so well on that and everything, I appreciate you studying. You need to adopt that study habit for when we get closer to our tests and stuff like that. I'm going to loosen it up a little bit just so I can kind of relax and talk about stuff I enjoy talking about. But the biggest thing about it is keep doing what you're doing, right? Keep studying. The first test is always a doozy because you're kind of getting used to my style. You're getting used to a huge amount of information in a history class. But let's go ahead and keep going with where we left off in class. Now, B period, I'm aware that you got a little bit further than this, so we know what happened with that fire drill and all that stuff. But it's going to be okay, and we'll get you figured out in the long run, right? So just kind of like either listen or skip ahead to the point where we got in class, which with y'all, we started with Athens, but with everybody else, I need to kind of like wrap up Sparta a little bit, right? So we started talking about the Spartan society, of course, right, in class. We talked about their government style being a council of elder and two kings, and how they actually originally kind of invented democracy before the Athenians ever did. We talked about how they're super militaristic. We talked about how children or boys at the age of 7 would go off to military training. We talked about the blood soup that they would eat every single day and how they had to train with no armor on. We talked about, in my B period, we talked about the myth of the perfect Spartan boy, right? So if you have time or if you remember this, hey, Mr. Terry, this is C period. We never got to hear the myth of a Spartan boy. I did run out a little bit of time, so it's okay. Just remind me and I'll tell it to you, okay? And then so at 20 was kind of where we left off. We were talking about how they were hyper militaristic and they were settled by the Dorians, and how, oh, big thing, super important. Highlight that thing about the helots, right? Highlight that thing about how they would use slave labor to try and keep their economy functioning so every other man could focus on becoming a soldier, right? So every time they would take over an area and that like group of people would lose to them in battle, they would adopt those people as slaves known as helots or helots, Helots, okay? I'm not going to get mad at you if you pronounce it any other weird way, because as we know, I have dyslexia, and I mispronounce stuff all the time. So I've been mispronouncing the word fasces for the wrong way. Found this out that I've been mispronouncing that word as faces for the last 7 years, okay? So happens to the best of us. It's not a big deal. It's the concept. It's not the pronunciation, right? So anyway, we talked about a lot of different stuff, but we left off talking about how, like, following military training, at the age of 20, Spartan men could go off and get married, right? But they had to live in the barracks for another 10 years. And what number about Spartan society does that kind of coincide with? Well, all Spartan citizens were actually considered 30-year-old men, right? So once a man left the barracks, he was considered like a Spartan citizen, and he could participate in the election of a council of elders. He could participate and actually understand, well, there's this other group of people called the E4s, right? So, and he could actually participate in society and be considered a citizen, right? And then he could live with his wife, and then he could start a family and all these other things. So that 30-year-old number for Spartan men is important. And then double that, right? As we know, Spartan men had to keep working out until they were 60 years old, because that's believed like the post-retirement soldier life, right? So other really important concept that we have to discuss is a lot of y'all are like, but what about the women? What about the women in Sparta? Where's their place? Where's their role? Something you need to understand is that women in Sparta did have a larger role in their society, all right? So, like, they had a much more, they're not equal. Let's not go ahead and let's not mess around about the fact that these ancient civilizations were not fair to women as a whole, right? But in Sparta, they were at least treated more properly than they were in Athens, right? Because women were actually like kind of like revered in a sense, because, like, for example, a big thing about them is they had to go and exercise and strengthen their bodies every single day. They had to meet up at like 6 a.m. every single day so they could actually theoretically produce strong warriors. So women were going through a training of their own. Just like the Spartan men were going off to military training, they believed that the women of the society needed to be strong as well to help produce strong soldiers, right? But the other super interesting parts about Spartan women is they could inherit property, right? If their husband died in battle, they could inherit their husband's property. Whereas in Athens, if the man died, the woman had to go live back with her husband, and all the property went to his next of kin, right? So women in Sparta could actually move through society a little bit easier, right? Apparently, I have heard of some historians argue that women in Sparta could initiate divorce, right? Which is another very, very big thing, kind of a more equality standard of women in Sparta. other interesting part about it is in Spartan society, only 2 people got tombstones. 2. If you died, you were usually just buried in a large grave and you would just kind of rot and go back into the earth. But in Spartan society, they would mark your grave if you were one of 2 types of people. 1, a man that died in battle after you were carried home lying on your own shield by your comrades. Or 2, if you were a woman that died during childbirth. You actually received a tombstone as well because it was considered a valorous honor for you to actually try and help the society in this way, right? Remember, their entire society dedicated, absolutely dedicated to that concept of militaristic life, right? And so Sparta, though, with all these militaristic ideas, it's not like they're going to be the most congenial in all of Greece. They're not going to be the ones talking to everybody all the time and constantly. So Sparta is actually going to kind of isolate themselves away from other Greeks unless they're waging war against them, right? Citizens were not allowed to travel. They didn't do much colonization at all. Like they did some later. There was a very famous colony called Syracuse. Actually, the Syracuse colony is now there's a city in New York that's actually named after the Syracuse colony. It was out in Sicily. So Sparta just did not function like other Greek city-states, especially during their Archaic period. The citizens were not allowed to travel. They were discouraged to trade, and this made them very unique and very deadly. Coupling that with that geographic isolation sense of ancient Greece, of those mountain ranges really separating most city-states in their fledgling state as they're growing and prospering into these other places, it did make them very unique and extremely deadly. But now we got to talk about Athens. Rule by the people. Yeah, okay. All right, so apparently the Athenians were ruled by the people. They claim they invented democracy, but they actually didn't. Technically, the Spartans invented it first. All right, but Athens is still a super important place to talk about because for how strong Sparta was militarily, Athens was that strong intellectually, right? So they actually are going to develop multi-system governments. They're going to create huge councils, these councils of people known as archons. They're going to bring in this concept of ostracism, which is a really neat, very, very cool idea of if you have a ruler that's not doing his job, you can ostracize him for a period of time to try and give society a chance to recuperate. And ostracism, of course, is throwing them into exile. They did it to a guy named Simon. They did it to a guy named Solon's runner-up. We'll talk about it later. All right, so anyway, but this, of course, is the very famous Acropolis of Athens, and that right there is the ruins of the Parthenon, right, which we will bring up multiple times. Now, again, the Athenians claimed to have been settled by the Ionians, right? They did not want to be actually lumped in with the people who settled the Spartan colonies, which were the Dorians, right? As we know, the Dorians, we believe, are the main group of people during the Greek Dark Ages, right? So there's a good chance that the Athenians were oh no, we weren't settled by these can't read, can't write, make these ugly, gross clay cups people. We want to be associated with a different class of people coming from a northern shore of Greece that could do a lot of things called the Ionians, right? Well, ironically enough, for somebody that actually pretentiously believes that they're so fancy-schmancy, they actually started out as a very messed up government, right? So their original government was really screwed up. And it started out as an aristocracy, right? So an aristocracy is when wealthy landowners are completely in charge, right? We're talking about the nobility, okay? So if you owned land, you would rent that land out to people that were less than you or laborers, right? You would rent that land out, and then there was a really big problem of this debt slavery thing that was going on because they now owed you money to work that land because you technically owned it. But the way these aristocrats set it up, you could never actually quite pay that debt off, right? Now, later on, though, this wealthy landowning aristocracy is going to turn into what's known as an oligarchy because then they're going to start separating the wealthiest of the wealthy nobles out of that aristocracy, and they're only going to allow a small number of hyper-wealthy citizens to actually rule their government, right? This is not fair. This is super messed up because it's going to push down the poor laboring parts of society and it's going to create an unequal, unrepresentative government, right? And so only issue is that this is also going to cause an extreme amount of wealth growth in the upper classes, right? It's going to grow extremely fast. And they're going to start pulling in some smaller Greek settlements as well to form one large city-state that you now know called Athens, right? So now, despite the fact that they were super, super, super messed up, one man does come along. This slide back here, not important. That's for the honors kids. So this slide, though, you do need. Then arises the very first government reformer. So this is the big attribute of Athens, right? Athens was reformed by a man named Solon, right? Solon is going to show up in about 594 BC, and he's going to be elected what's known as Archon, or one of the leaders of the city-state, one of the original oligarchs, right? And so when he comes into charge, he changes the government forever. He's considered the father of modern government, right? So he took the elements of democracy in Sparta, and he's going to apply it to Athens in a more representative, fair way. He's going to outlaw debt slavery and this thing called the horos, right? The horos is this stone that would sit on your property, actually inscribing on it all the things that you owed to the landowner from the oligarchy, right? And so he's going to outlaw debt slavery. He's going to be like, you cannot force these poor people to work this land all this time because they need to function in the economy so they can actually grow their own wealth and look out for themselves, right? And he's going to push Athens towards a representative democracy, right? And he's going to make leadership based on wealth, not lineage, right? So he's going to say, look, we do need the wealthier classes to still be in charge, but we're not going to make it so my son is going to rule after me. We're going to make this more based on, like, the wealthy actually have the ability to send their kids to school and grow, et cetera, et cetera. And so Athens is going to go through several other really great leaders and then several other really garbage leaders, right? And so a few rebellions are going to pop up back and forth until Solon's government is really finally realized, right? And then once this happens, the Athenian democracy becomes realized. So Solon started a trend, right? And there was a several number of leaders following him, okay? But once those several leaders were done, and once a couple of bad leaders were ostracized, which we're going to talk about here in a second, the Athenian democracy is going to be realized, right? Everyone was going to be allowed to vote, as long as you weren't a woman. Now, anyway, so this is, again, right, Athens was very, very prejudicial against their women. And so big thing about voting in Athens, though, it was a different system. Whereas in Sparta, they elected these people known as ephors, or these elders, right? This council of elders, and those elders would then elect the next two kings, right? And so the big thing about the council of ephors, though, is it wasn't voted on in a sense. It was kind of more like a tribunal election. Whereas in Athens, they're going to create a system of voting to choose this council of people known as archons, right? And these archons would actually rule over the government for them. So this is that whole thing. You can vote on these wealthy men that you think actually represent your ideas instead of just voting for some guy, well, not voting at all, and then that guy's kid taking over, right? So the big thing about voting in Athens, though, is apparently they would have big vases, right? Actually sitting at the end of these big hills of rocks, right? And so apparently when you would vote in Athens, you would walk up to the pile of rocks that belonged to the guy you wanted to vote for. You would pick up one of those rocks. Usually it had a color or a distinct color like white, black, clay, something like that. And you would take that rock over to the voting pot and you would drop your vote into the pot. And then they would smash the pot open and then they would count up all the votes to see who actually won the election, right? And that's super intense. And that's a very big element of modern day democracy, is that idea of a vote, right? That is a big deal, okay? So yes, we do give credit to the Spartans for inventing democracy, but Athens kind of made it better, especially under the reforms of that guy named Solon, right? So another big thing that's going to come in after Solon's reforms are realized is this concept called ostracism, right? So if a king or a ruler or an archon was doing a bad job and was turning into what is known as a tyrant, right, that person could be ostracized, again, by a popular vote or for the rest of the archons to decide that you're being a bad leader, right? And ostracized means that you were literally thrown out of society and exiled for a period of time, and then you would later be allowed to come back, right? And that gave Athens enough time to undo any of the negative effects that you actually did, right? So big other thing about Athens is it was divided into a series of tribes, kind of like regional states, which actually gave them the ability to rule a larger area much more efficiently, okay? They would actually pass these new decrees down to each tribe, and each tribal leader would actually then pass those decrees on to their society, right? So it's a more efficient system of kind of like a bureaucracy, kind of like they had in Egypt, right? And this new government made other governments like Sparta furious, right? Because they were afraid that these ideas would spread to their society, because you don't want people like the Helots in Sparta start thinking that they have rights like everybody else, because Sparta was set up on kind of a military distinction. It was more ruled by kind of the military pay grade of your general and your soldier, right? Not so much like picking your leaders and stuff. Because actually in Sparta, one of the kings was actually a hierarchical standpoint. His son would take over when he was actually done, or the election of a general out of the army would occur if he actually had no sons in general. So a lot of other governments are going to be like, we don't want these ideas spreading because it's going to lead to rebellion and uprising, right? But Athenians keep doing it all they want. They don't really care, right? And so the big part about it is this grew their wealth, this grew their territory, and this grew their attributes. And it's kind of what they're best known for as being the inventors of like the modern version of democracy, right? But all the while they're doing this and they're creating these new amazing like governmental perspectives, which is awesome, they're also subjugating their own class of people. We all look at Sparta as being like, oh my God, you had slaves that you took over from these different places, these colonies and stuff, and you made them work for you, and that's really messed up. Well, all the while Athens is really being absolutely awful and offensive to their women, right? Because women were not allowed to vote. Women had to run the house, right? Women were only essential to come out of the house for things like religious rituals, and they could not leave their home without the position of a man. They never were allowed to sleep in the room with their husbands because it was expected that their husband was sleeping with other women, known as like concubines, right? And it was a very messed up system, right? So women were only allowed to go to one place without asking their husband's permission, and it actually has to do with going to the well to retrieve water, right? And so you never saw women in the agora, you never saw women in the economy, you never saw women in shops, you never saw them moving around society. So in Athens, if you left your home, you were basically around nothing but men, right? And we'll talk about how that gets really messed up a little bit later on, and how it leads to even more disenfranchisements of rights of other people, right? So it was like that. Yes, Athens created a government with ostracism and voting and democratic values and moved away from an aristocracy and an oligarchy, and that's awesome. But they were also treating someone pretty negatively at the same time, right? So they had their own subjugated class. And also Athens had slaves as well, so we shouldn't be looking at them as like these like kind of pillars of elitism or anything like that. But they did also kind of in a good way adopt a very positive educational system, right? So you have to understand is that the Athenians did adopt a sophisticated idea of education, even though this was also prejudicial to the poor, right? Because the only people that were allowed to actually receive an education in Athens were wealthy boys, right? So as you can see right here, here is the instructor, right? Again, look, everyone in this image is a male, right? So here's the instructor, right? Actually probably teaching poetry to this student, and this student right here is playing an instrument, right? So music was taught in these schools as well, and that instrument right there is known as a lap lyre, right? Looks kind of like a harp, right? It's a stringed instrument, but he's learning what's known as a lap lyre. Now, anyway, so boys would attend schools if the family could afford it, right? Which in Athens was not a ton of them, right? A lot of the poor laboring families could not afford to send their children to school. But at school, they would learn a multi-subject curriculum. And in these schoolings, they would actually learn things like reading, writing, music, poetry. And here's another really important one, public speaking, all right? Why would Athenians train their wealthy elite boys public speaking? It all relates to their government, right? When these boys left school, if they wanted to participate in the political system, possibly be elected to an office inside of their tribe, or maybe eventually elected what it's known as Archon, right? One of the leaders of Athens, which they had a council of them, and at one point I think there was 9 of them. There was like 9 Archons of Athens. If they wanted to get elected to these positions, they needed to know how to speak to a crowd of people they were trying to convince to vote for them, right? So our system, we're coming up on an election right now, right, in November, that has a system of voting and everything like that. And so this voting system in our election has its bedrock in ancient Athens. Like a lot of these traditions and a lot of these ideas were started thousands of years ago, and we're still using them, right? That's why it's so important to learn this stuff. Now, again, also Athenian boys are going to receive some, but not much military training whatsoever, right? But the big thing we got to get into now is now we're going to move into... So now we're going to get into talking about the Persian Wars, right? So now we've talked about the establishment of Sparta as being one half of the super strong city-states in ancient Greece, right? And then we talked about Athens becoming the strong intellectual half and governmental half in ancient Greece, right? And that's during their Archaic period, though, right? Because remember, the Archaic period was defined as this era of ancientness, original use, old / out of date. It's when Athens and Sparta were starting to grow, right? They're starting to grow up and they're moving forward, and they're creating cultures all their own, right? Well, the Archaic period, write this down, the end of the Archaic period is known as ending with these things known as the Persian Wars, right? Persian Wars, right? The Persian Wars. Because let's take a second and step back. And some of you are like, well, Persia, I know I've heard about them. I know on that one quiz, Mr. Terry gave us the answer because he doesn't feel like he taught us them very, very well, which I didn't. So, like, it's just somebody I just don't know. I know a lot about them. I just don't like teaching about them. The coolest thing about it is their leaders, like Darius, who we're going to talk about in a second, and like Xerxes, who we'll talk about in class. But anyway, so like Persia was a massive empire, and they were growing super quickly. And what is a big thing about empires that are growing? They want to keep growing, right? Well, we're now going to start getting close to the Greeks, right? The Persians had grown all the way into this region over here. Well, that means that they're going to start rubbing up against Greece, particularly in their colonies, right? Because that was a major theme I told you to write down. Not this flip, but the last flip, that the Greeks were big-time colonizers, right? And so at the end of the Archaic period, Greece is going to grow its colonies to be like right here in the base of Italy, some all the way out in Spain, and then also surrounding the entire Black Sea, but particularly in this region right here known as Ionia, right? So they covered a huge amount of land, and the Ionians were originally settled by a small contingent of Athenians, right? So that tells us right there, though, this is the Persian Empire. So as you can see, here's Greece's colonies, here's the Persian Empire. They are going to meet each other at some point, right? They are going to interact with one another. It's coming, okay? So what's going to end up occurring is this thing known as the Persian Wars, right? Because despite the fact that Persia was a dominating force, and you would think that an empire this big could easily pick off, like, okay, we'll just take over Athens, and then we'll take over Sparta, because we're gigantic and nobody is going to stop us, and also, they're not even united, right? Athens and Sparta don't even like each other, right? And despite the fact that Athens and Sparta did not like each other, because Sparta was furious about Athens' government, and Athens was furious about how Sparta dealt with things, right? Despite these ties, the Greek city-states actually are going to unite to actually fight off these Persians, right? So the end of the Archaic period is seen in these Persian Wars because, spoiler alert, when they actually beat the Persians, it gives them the chance to enter into their classical period, or a period of massive growth, right? Because this giant enemy that they've just pushed back can now stay away and give them room and time to grow into this amazing, 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 amazing ancient civilization, which was really mean to women, but we're not getting into that right now. So it all started, well, first of all, let's go ahead and jump back. Jump back, reel it back, reel it back, reel it back, reel it back. I need you to write something down. Here's the ultimate irony. A lot of people refer to these things as the Persian Wars. Technically, they're not wars, all right? So if you want to get into the historical thematics, right, wars are when two independent nations, city-states, and or kingdom territories declare war on one another. It would be like if Terriopolis decided to like claim war against like the kingdom of Wooderson right downstairs on the floor below me. He would have to acknowledge that claim of war, then actually declare war back on me, and once these wars were over, things would go to the victor, and things would be taken from the loser, right? And then agreed upon peace terms would actually be found. These aren't wars, all right? This is the ancient time period, right? This is actually during the 500s BC, 500 years before Christ was born, right? Fun fact, though, the Romans are actually starting their like whole civilization, like right over here, and they're just like little tiny guys. But anyway, so the big thing about it is they're not wars. Write this down. It was actually one revolt and two invasions, right? One revolt, two invasions. And these invasions are actually characterized by just a couple of really big battles, right? When you think of wars, you think of massive, years-long campaigns of this empire trying to knock out this country and da-da-da-da-da-da. It's actually one revolt and two invasions, right? So getting into it, the Ionian Revolt is where it all started, right? So Ionia was this small little colony right over on the edge of the Black Sea, right? Athens had originally colonized it, and Persia was growing and growing and growing, getting super big, right? So the Persians decide that they want to conquer this Greek colony known as Ionia, right? Now also, interesting little factoid, right? Put a star next to this fact underneath, like, it can go anywhere. It doesn't have to go in any of these particular places, right? Persia, not a bad empire to be taken over by, all right? So just so you understand, the Persians, this is what you need. Practice this thing known as tolerance, right? Tolerance. So a lot of times in film and in movies, we oftentimes portray the Persians as this like conquering horde of guys wearing leather and being on horses and having all these bows and arrows and stuff like that. Well, yeah, they were a huge military and they could take over just about anybody, but the Persians practiced this concept of tolerance, right? Actually originally done under one of their leaders known as Cyrus the Great, who in the Bible is actually mentioned as being one of the greatest leaders to ever exist, right? Like the Old Testament sings songs of how amazing Cyrus the Great was, right? And he was a Persian king. So this element of tolerance wasn't a bad thing to live underneath, right? So the Persian Empire would allow you to keep your customs, keep your government, keep your religion, keep your songs, keep your this, keep your that, and let you do whatever you wanted to do. But the only thing, the caveat they asked for is like, pay tribute to us as your empiric leader and pay taxes. That's it. Because that would benefit the Persian Empire in the long run. So ironically enough, now you can get into rewriting all this stuff. So the Persians take over Ionia, and they're like, okay, you're going to be usurped into our empire, so you can do whatever you want. Talk about being Greek, be Greek all you want, blah, 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 do whatever, and all you got to do is pay your taxes. Now, a big thing about taxes during this time period, it was usually paid in agricultural products, right? And so the Ionians then decided to be like, and start freaking out. Like, they start flipping out and then burning all of their fields and start attacking Persian military contingents. And they start being like, no. When the Persians were like, we're going to let you do whatever you wanted to do, calm down. And the reason that the Persians are going to get so mad is because apparently they found out that the Athenians were secretly sending weapons and ships to aid the Ionians in their rebellion, right? So this is going to infuriate the Persians, causing a later invasion, right? But we're going to stop there, okay? That right there was probably one of the most important slides on this entire flip, the explanation of tolerance and kind of the duality of understanding that Persia wasn't necessarily this conquering horde, and also the Athenians and the Ionians messing, like they were kind of messing up too, and it led to a big conflict. But we're going to stop right here, and we're going to pick up on the Ionian revolt, which of course occurred in about 546 BC, in our next class. So I'll see you guys then. Y'all have a good one.